So I'm talking today about a project I've been working on for a little bit about fermented foods and their connections to the microbiome, hopefully published any day now in the Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine. Uh, Ethnobiologists like myself are pretty used to seeing landscapes like this as biocultural spaces. None of us would look at this, right, and say that this is all natural. This is all something that has a history and a politics and a sociality to it. Um, and yet we might be a little bit more hesitant, or we might not be quite primed to look at something like this, fermented cabbages with rice and meat in them, and understand that these two are socio-ecological landscapes. But of course they are. Fermentation secures an access to this kind of socio-ecological relationship as long as we're primed to look at it at the level of the microbes and the microbiome, whether that's the microbial ecology of fermented foods or within our own bodies. Ferments are interesting for all kinds of other reasons. They secure access to heritage ideas of taste and nutrition, food security. They secure access to various kinds of knowledge, recipe sharing networks. They are great vehicles for gifts in that they are literally exchanging living spirits of others and senses of other places and ideas as we exchange them. And this, for me, begged two interesting kind of questions. First, essentially, is my sauerkraut different from your sauerkraut? And is that difference going to be something that results from the different craft or heritage practices that we both take with us in how we prepare these foods? Let alone, do these then have something within them that would measurably impact our microbiomes? Studies of cheese and sauerkraut, for instance, show that the general microbial ecologies of these two foods are fairly similar, and yet there's a lot of variation that we perceive as taste. The difference between, a Parmesan versus a blue cheese versus Gruyere, say. The second question is, do these these microbial communities then impact our own bodies in ways that might have some long-standing effect? Because this is the argument of the probiotics industry, or microbiologists say that work for the Dannon yogurt team. Fundamentally, these are sociocultural questions that have to do with how people live and eat. They represent the structuring conditions under which microbial landscapes in our foods and in our bodies get formed. And so to answer this question, we joined a 2018 workshop led by fermentation revivalists Sandor Katz. I, a cultural anthropologist, collected interview and participatory data, while Joseph Orkin, an anthropologically trained geneticist, collected biological samples of fermented foods and human stools. To keep personal identities and potential health data anonymous, we use pseudonyms here. We additionally assigned color codes to everybody's individual sample and did so to dissociate identifiable personal genetic information from a microbial analysis and from any kind of qualitative analysis. And this means that no geneticist, including Joe, had access to identifiable information from workshop participants, and no qualitative analyst, including me, had access to any of that raw genetic data at any time. Best practices are likely to change, and we're reporting this to be upfront about what we've done and pay the utmost respect to the privacy and wishes of our interlocutors. We ended up talking to a number of people and collecting qualitative data that we transcribed into themes and codes using QDA Miner. It's a qualitative data analysis software. We also then collected biological samples, so 140 samples of fermented foods that were frozen in liquid nitrogen to capture a snapshot of living microbes in them, and then around 50 stool samples, pictured here, preserved in ethanol, collected each morning by the very good-natured participants of the workshop. So, ultimately, we're interested in how stories and experiences with fermentation might then translate into a socio-ecological consequence. Here, a different microbial ecology. You can see here that foods and stools have very distinct microbial communities. That's a good and expected thing. The food samples were often dominated by a small number of taxa. Microbial ecologies in fermented foods are fairly extreme environments. Fecal microbial communities are more diverse. Our bodies are less extreme in that sense. Fecal samples, as you can see here, clustered by individual. So the microbial ecologies that you have within you are likely to stay the same as a function of your own homeostasis. Diet alone isn't a dominant determinant of this composition. In considering the experiences of fermenters, we benefit from a agrarian or ethnobiological focus on fermentation as a practice that has socio-ecological consequences. I want to call our attention here to the ways in which specific cultural values then have microbiological consequences in practice. So a lot of people talked about creativity and tactile work. With this work that I do, even just something as simple as slicing up a cabbage can feel like, here's what I've done. There's immediate satisfaction with others, and they can join you around the table. This is a pastor from Pennsylvania. For others, fermentation provided an outlet for some creativity. I'll look at a recipe and follow it, but I'm always riffing on it. And later somebody said, I feel constitutionally unable to exactly follow a recipe. And that has a consequence. This creativity manifests in the non-homogeneous tastes and practices that make possible a diverse set of bacterial genera. Fermented food samples clustered largely according to their broader food category, so grains or beans or milks or vegetables. But these clusters suggest that under real world conditions, you can see that there's some variation within each of these communities, even when they're all made in the same place. There are clear differences within food types. Sweet potato fly and poutsai, these are higher diversity communities than sauerkraut or kimchi, which means that not all fermented foods offer the same benefits or even the same kind of probiotic benefits. Throughout the fermentation process, you can see substantial changes in the microbial communities that are measurable as they ferment over time. In some cases, there's a pretty quick transition from highly diverse to nearly uniform. That's the case in tempeh, which is a fermented food that gets nearly covered in white mold. After 24 hours, the bacterial community was almost entirely of the genus Bacillus. After a full day of fermentation, kimchi came to be dominated primarily by bacteria in the genus Lactobacillus, a known probiotic, famous for its sour taste. Elsewhere, subtle changes in preparation can bring about major differences in microbial communities, and this is where poutsai comes in. We had 3 different samples of poutsai, which is a Szechuan vegetable fermented food that you continually add new fresh veggies to. Poutsai that had been fermenting for a week in one case and then 6 months in another. These are poutsai 1 and 2. They've had relatively similar bacterial profiles, as you can see. These are the first 2 bar graphs that are highlighted here. Poutsai 3, which we were able to sample a couple of times, basically lacked this genus of bacteria, Enterobacteriaceae, that was found in the other samples. It had entirely different things living in it. Because poutsai has regularly new vegetables and seasonings added, this is probably a good source of a really diverse source of potential probiotic microbes. A lot of fermenters talked about the healing power of probiotics, chronic illnesses, cancer, HIV, GI distress. Warren, a cancer survivor, explained that when he first encountered fermented foods, he was looking at peer-reviewed literature on probiotics. And he said, I'm the kind of person who, when it happened, I was all in. All right, let's fight it. Let's take this on. And in fact, we identified 25 genera of bacteria, genuses of bacteria, that were both in fermented foods and in human guts that are relatively rare and that are known probiotics. This is probably a comfort to our participants who expressed that desire. Each participant clearly had their own homeostasis, as we saw, and they moved within a personal range. But given the differences in gut microbiome observed throughout populations and other research, and the 25 genera that we identify here, it's really very likely that this indicates that these foods are moving directly from fermented foods into human bodies. And it's reasonable then that fermented foods consumed in situ as part of a regular diet would, in the course of your life, influence your gut microbiome composition. Broad categories of foods like dairy and vegetable had overall similar microbiological communities, but home ferments really do seem to provide this mechanism for a personalized microbiodiverse meal, more so than you would find in a commercial fermented foods, most of which are sterilized and then inoculated with specific strains to provide that uniformity of taste and consistency that's necessary for regulatory approval. The idea that cultural landscapes are formed in this process between social and ecological factors is pretty normal to us. What we're just focusing the attention here is on a slightly smaller scale. We think it's reasonable that these foods can induce potentially probiotic microbes to human guts with at least some good short-term benefits. In combining these two methods of cultural anthropology and microbiology, we're also really stressing this thing that's important to a lot of us here, which is collaborative multidisciplinary fieldwork to ask about complicated questions like health and production and our place in the food system. A lot of this research is done nutritionally in controlled field trials or controlled clinical trials. What's exciting is that this is the only research we know about where we've collected this kind of data in situ. We had a number of critical reviews that asked us about potential confounds, but of course for an ethnobiologist, the confounds are just life. We hope to build on this tradition even as we're shrinking the scale. Here's a nice recipe for Indiana sauerkraut if anybody's interested. Thanks very much to everyone.